Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a breakdown of the sensor performance of the new Fuji X-T30. I'll do a little bit of comparison to the X-T3 just to make sure that the sensors do behave in a similar fashion. But I'm primarily going to compare it to the Sony platform, which I think is probably the chief competitor when it comes to the APS-C mirrorless space. And so, of course, Sony has, what is currently the best sensor when it comes to dynamic range on the market. It's a very good performer for high ISO. So it provides a pretty good benchmark to compare the 26 megapixel X-Trans sensor in the X-T30. And so today we're going to take a look at a few different metrics. We'll take a look at the dynamic range. We'll take a look at the high ISO performance. We'll take a look at color fidelity and also examine the, the Fuji actually has a few different modes for dynamic range, and so we'll take a look at how that plays out and how that could be advantageous if you're in a situation where you want to preserve highlights and get a little bit better dynamic range. So let's jump in and let's take a look to see how these two models compare. Okay, the first thing we'll look at in terms of the ISO performance is to see how similar the X-T30 and X-T3's sensor actually is here at ISO 12,800, which is kind of the upper limit for the X-T3, and then you start to go into expanded range. What we see is we examine kind of the shadowed area and some of these dark areas here is that the noise level is really roughly similar between the two. I would certainly say that these are behaving pretty much similar. And if you look in this area here, the amount of just noise that is there in all of this, it's behaves a fair bit like film grain. And stepping back and looking at the image globally, I would say that I would still consider this to be usable, but you would have to be careful that to nail exposure when it comes to that. And so I would say, from what I can tell, they are behaving pretty much similarly. So what happens if you compare the high ISO performance with that of what I consider to be a top competitor, and that would be the Sony censored cameras. Now I'm using an a6400. You would see similar results from an a6400, which is basically priced the same way. Now there is a different overall exposure here because we're working with different base ISO, and so I've just worked accordingly with that. As you can see, there is a slight variance in exposure value here, but it's not significant. What we can see looking at our main subject is that I would say that both of them look fairly similar. If we move on down here, and we're just mostly looking for the appearance of noise, they don't render identically, but in many ways there's more similarities than difference. Here I see a little bit more noise on the Sony than with the Fuji. Looking up into the out of focus area here though, I mean, the noise patterns, they're slightly different, but I would say that the Fuji is doing a pretty good job of holding its own in this kind of setting. And so I give it good marks because the Sony sensors are obviously very, very good ones. Now at ISO 12,800, we can see that once again, it's still fairly clean here on the clock face, or the timer face really. Moving down here, you can see that there is maybe a little bit more pronounced noise from the Sony, and you can see that here. The Fuji is really doing quite a good job here under the circumstance and staying pretty clean. Let's look like up in this area here. And I do think that the noise pattern, it kind of presents a little bit differently because they aren't metered maybe 100% identical. And so at the same time, however, I think that the Fuji is showing it to be pretty strong here at this level, and giving arguably a little bit cleaner looking image compared to the Sony. Now up at ISO 25,600, I've brought the Sony's exposure down just a little bit because it's hitting up near the shutter limit. And so what we can see here is that looking at the clock face, you can definitely see more visible noise on both of them. And I would say that the Fuji has actually gotten rougher here. So at 12,800, I think I would give Fuji the win. At 25,600, I would say probably the Sony is, maybe a hair better. Just the noise pattern has gotten much more obvious on the Fuji than it has in terms of a big leap on the Sony. They're still not terribly different, but you can just see, like in this area here, you've got more roughness as compared. And so up to 12,800, I give win to Fuji. After that, I give the win to Sony. Now, Sony sensors have long been regarded as being some of the very best when it comes to dynamic range in both shadow and highlight recovery. And as you can see here, it is pretty remarkable. This is from the a6400. So we've got a shot that was underexposed by 4 stops. And, you know, if we take a look at the recovered image here on the right, you can see that we've managed to recover with, you know, really relatively low damage, all of those stops. And so, I mean, all of this information has been recovered. If we look like on this camera, you can see lots of information on the cover of the Bible and other books. You can see, once again, I mean, just lots of information, shadow information that's recovered with relatively low penalty. So the question is Fuji going to be able to match that? And that's what we're going to take a quick look at in comparison between the two here. So with both cameras at their base ISO and recovering by 4 stops, let's see what we find here. So we can see that looking at the center of the frame, both of them have done a good job on that, which that's one of the least challenging. Let's take a look at a more challenging subject like here in this area. What we can see is that both of them really have done quite a good job of recovering all the information that was lost in the shadow. So look in this area here. The exposure, there's one extra third stop, just the way that they ended up metering out, that differentiates these two figures. But we can see that both of them have done a really clean job at base ISO of recovering shadow information with, I would say, relatively little penalty to be seen here. There is a little bit of noise in some areas here. For example, here on the Fuji, you see a bit more, but I would say we have a roughly equal performance overall. Now, as is typical on the other end of the spectrum, things get a little bit more difficult. Recovering highlights, most cameras are not as good as recovering highlights as they are shadows. We can see here from this extreme 4-stop example of overexposure that is going to be the case here, where information is really not entirely recovered. There is stuff that is, kind of blown out and lost, where texture information has been lost. Let's see how it compares to the Sony. Now what we can see here, if we can compare the Sony on the right to the Fuji on the left, is that Sony does win this. You can see that there's information that was lost on the Fuji that has been retained on the Sony. And it's just a little bit more of a credible end result as we take a look at this. For example, this area here is completely lost, whereas the Sony has managed to retain it. And so that's where the strength of Sony is shown in retaining those highlights at base ISO. So taking things outside, you can see here that, for, a basic kind of scene, there's plenty of latitude for pulling back a sky and pulling open shadows. And we'll just take a quick peek in here. We can see that we have successfully raised these shadows without introducing a lot of additional noise here. And so a clean result. You can see like this area here, and there's a little bit of noise there, but we've got one more trick up Fuji's sleeve to show you another technique for approaching that. Fuji actually has a special mode, which they call DR400, that you access through the quick menu. And what it does is it's actually designed for you to, for one thing, you can only use it at ISO 640. And so what you do is that you actually, when you go into that mode, you basically keep the exposure the same as what you would have at base ISO. And then what you're doing is, so as you can see, the image it takes is, wildly overexposed as far as the highlights go, but it's very nicely exposed for the shadows. And so what you can do then is that in post, you can pull that back down and the shadow areas. And so now, as we can see, if we look into our shadow information, we have got, really nicely preserved shadows. And so lots of information that's there and really clean. What it actually does in this mode is it actually divides off to where, while it's raising up and amplifying the signal for the shadow information, it's actually retaining the highlight information of base ISO. And so what you end up with is is the shadows have actually been preserved in here, or excuse me, the highlights have actually been preserved. And so you can see that there isn't a loss of information. And so you have that full latitude of playing with that. And so it actually allows you to achieve a really nice dynamic range. We can see how that plays out, for example, here with the Sony a6500. And so obviously we have overexposed here, but even though the Sony has a fantastic dynamic range, you've got really bad hotspots here, areas where information has been permanently lost because of it just exceeds the dynamic range of the camera. Now, if we engage that, that DR 400 that we've got here, what you can see is we've got a pretty significant advantage in that we've got plenty of latitude to play with shadow information, and so we have really, really clean shadows that are actually, recovered more cleanly than what they are in Sony. But difference is that obviously there's a lot more information that is retained. As far as, here in this hot spot here, even in the sky, although there is still some lost information, there's a better way to shoot here. I actually exposed more for 4-stop, so I exceeded, just to match up with the Sony. So I exceeded the potential of this. But at the same time, you can see there's a lot more preserved information and a much more natural looking image that's come out of using this approach. So finally, let's just go, moving away from dynamic range for a moment, let's look at color here for a moment, because this is obviously something that is that people talk a lot about when it comes to Fuji and debates over the actual color information. And so we'll swap these again for consistency's sake, put Fuji on the left. So as far as color goes, I've done my best to equalize color temperature, which, they don't behave identically, but just taking a look at colors, Sony exhibits a little deeper degree of saturation, particularly in yellow channels, and that's, fairly typical for a Sony. Then what we can see in the Rode is that, maybe saturation levels look a little bit more intense out of the box on this. But, kind of two different approaches to color, and obviously this is, one particular scene. You can't really draw a big conclusion maybe out of one shot, and it's been noted that, Sony colors are actually quite good for landscapes, maybe less good for, for faces and things like that. Although, with all of these, if you're shooting in RAW, you have the ability to tweak color, once you become familiar with how color works on a certain camera to get the results that you want. But anyway, there's just kind of a basic comparison. I'm not going to draw a conclusion one direction or another. What I will say is that you can get beautiful images out of the Fuji camera, and here using that kit lens, you can see, highly detailed image, lots of beautiful colors that are there. Here's another example here where I think the color is just really, really beautiful. Nice levels of saturation while still retaining a natural look to it. And here's another here. This is going back to the kit lens, and so greens look good here. And I'm happy with the overall look of that. Here where, I purposely kind of went a little bit cooler to get this look, but once again, I think that the colors actually here are quite lovely. This is Camland 28mm f1.4 and a beautiful end result from that. And here once again, this is shooting with the 50mm f1.1 Camland lens. But once again, I think a really beautiful display of color there. So certainly, I mean, if you learn how to maximize the benefits of any particular camera system, including this Fuji X-T30, I think you can really get some fantastic results out of it. And so as you can see, I would say that at the end of the day, kind of an absolute performance, I think that Sony probably still has a very minor edge in some areas. However, what we did see is that throughout basically most of the native range up to ISO 12800, that Fuji is really just as good while also providing a couple extra megapixels of resolution. So kudos to them when it comes to that. At 25,600, I think Sony has got the win there. When it comes to dynamic range, in terms of the basic dynamic range at base ISO, Sony definitely has an edge when it comes to that. Mostly in highlight recovery, shadow recovery, they're more similar than different. However, we do see that if you're going to shoot in those situations and you like Fuji and what it has to offer, then I would say become familiar with how and when to use their dynamic range mode. They actually have a couple of different modes that you can access outside of just the base. They have their DR100, which is kind of just the base dynamic range. They have a DR200, which you can access at only an extra stop of light if you want to play with that. Then, as we noted, the ISO, or not the ISO, but the DR400, you can only access at ISO 640 and higher. And obviously, the cleanest results you're going to find are going to come when you're shooting at ISO 640. The higher you go, the more just noise you're going to introduce because of the climbing ISO. But certainly some some advantages to play with. However, at the end of the day, also with Sony, you're able to shoot at base ISO of 100, which is a lower ISO to begin with, and you're able to get really good dynamic range right out of the box. At the end of the day, however, I wouldn't say that there is a huge difference when it comes to sensor performance between these two. In many ways, I think if I were making this decision, I would look more at the complete system and see which system has the lenses and the accessories and the price point that I prefer. Because I think both, the X-T30, the new A6400, and of course I compared to the A6500, they have their advantages and disadvantages, but particularly A6400 and X-T30, they're batting at pretty much the same price point. And so, and if you prioritize having a really small body, X-T30 gives you a little bit of advantage when it comes to that. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have linkage to an image gallery from the X-T30. I've used a variety of lenses on it, taken some beautiful pictures. You can check that out. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase for yourself, either that or the A64 or A6500. And stay tuned for my final upcoming verdict on the X-T30, and I'll break down, a lot of things from autofocus performance to, performance when it comes to things like video and things like that. So stay tuned for that. And of course, if you haven't already, you can find links below to follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, become a patron, and get advanced screenings of upcoming content. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.